Today I'm delighted to be joined by Leo Van Hove, Professor of Economics at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. He kindly wrote a foreword for the Payments Digital Divide paper that we published back in June, and in that foreword he mentioned a paper that he was working on, and that one of the possible titles he was considering was Who's Afraid of the Cashless Society? And I thought, now there is a great topic for an episode of Navigating Digital Payments.
Welcome to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline, bringing you the latest innovations, trends and predictions about the future of payments.
Hello and welcome to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast. I'm David Daly. I look after the Discovery Hub here at Worldline, and I'm really thrilled to have with me today Professor Leo Van Hove from the Vrije Universiteit of Brussels. Hi Leo, welcome to the podcast.
Hello David.
Great to have you joining us. So later I really want to come back to you to answer this question about who is afraid of a cashless society. And I also want to get your views, your thoughts on how some countries are actually starting to move more towards digital payments. And I also want to know kind of how you think we can help people or encourage people to try new ways of paying. But before we come on to all of that, I wanted to come back to that foreword that you wrote for our Payments Digital Divide paper, where you mentioned this paper that you were working on and this possible title of Who's Afraid of a Cashless Society. So could you already share a little bit about the work you did there and some of the conclusions you reached?
Well, actually the paper is not finished yet. We have descriptive results, but we still have to do most of the econometrics, but I can obviously say something about the raw results. So the data that we analyze in the paper stem from the so-called Digital Payment Barometer, a tool that we have developed for 5 key players in the Belgian payments landscape, Worldline being one of them, by the way. So this barometer is an annual survey amongst a representative sample of Belgian consumers. Sample size is roughly 1,200. And the idea behind the survey is to collect key data points concerning, say, the digitization of retail payments in Belgium, as well as consumers' attitude towards this evolution. And the survey was conducted first time in March 2020. Just prior to the first national lockdown. By chance, we were very lucky there. A second time in March 2021, so during COVID, and then most recently in March this year, at a time when just about all of the restrictions had disappeared. Internally, we talk about the post-COVID edition. And the main conclusion of the most recent edition of the barometer is that COVID-19 clearly has had a lasting impact on Belgians' payment behavior. So last year, in 2021, so during COVID, we observed a clear jump in the adoption and use of contactless cards, also, and especially even amongst the elderly. And this year we find that the popularity of contactless payments, and to a smaller extent also mobile payments, continues to increase. To give just one example, in the 55-64 age group, prior to the pandemic, only 40% had already paid contactless at least once. And last year this jumped from 40% to 64%, and this year the number is 81%. So we see continued growth in the popularity of contactless. It's not as if people have returned to contact-based now that the concerns about hygiene have abated. This said, we do see a small recovery of the use of cash, but that was to be expected in view of the reopening compared to March 2021 of relatively cash-intensive sectors such as cafes and restaurants, parts of the entertainment sector, you name it.
So Leo, that's firstly, I guess it's obviously purely coincidental that you happen to be conducting these 3 editions of the Payments Barometer pre-pandemic, or just pre-pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic and post-pandemic. But also I guess that's a particularly interesting time to actually see those changes that you describe. Do you have any theories about the stickiness then of the change in payments habits? Because I guess what I was thinking is that I see some things like mask wearing, which certainly in the UK, people did it, and if they were instructed to, and it was the rules, they wore masks. But now that it's no longer required, I would say the majority of people now are not wearing masks in stores. Some people still do. But it sounds like with payments, some of the habits that have changed or developed during the pandemic have remained after the pandemic.
That would indeed seem to be the case. And I think it is because people have had to pay in a certain way during a certain amount of time, not just 1 week or a couple of days, but a prolonged period of time. And indeed, during that period, apparently consumers have, especially the first-time users, have experienced the convenience, for example, of contactless and realized, okay, this is actually better or more convenient than what I used to do, and it's pretty simple. So they clearly continue to use it.
And how much do you think the length of time is a factor versus the first time use? Because I remember reading a book once where I think they said that you have to do something every day for 30 days before it becomes a new habit.
I think it matters, yes. Yeah. It's difficult to pinpoint just exactly how many days, but I remember an experiment we did years ago in the restaurant of the VUB. And in that experiment, we encouraged people by means of posters that were next to the cash register to pay electronically as much as possible. Yeah. One thing that we noticed is that once the posters had disappeared, a lot of people returned to their previous payment habits and started using cash again.
I mean, that's just very interesting from the point of view as well of I would say a poster encouraging people is quite a light touch. This is not a really strong push, and yet still it sounds like anecdotally that does have an impact on people's behaviours. I guess moving on then to other things that can impact how people choose to pay, regulation and government requirements can obviously make a difference. And I know in Belgium, I think since July, all businesses are now required to accept some form of electronic payment. Can you talk a little bit about what's led to that push, I suppose, from the government, and what you think some of the impacts might be there?
Well, I'm not fully abreast of the political process behind it all, but one reason has clearly been the fight against tax evasion. I also referred to the introduction of so-called white cash registers in cafes in Belgium. But apart from that, it's clear that the requirement will also lead to improved convenience for consumers. A couple of years ago, I wrote a column on the occasion of the publication of a report by the European Central Bank. And this report revealed that when asked about their favorite means of payment in a retail setting, 66% of Belgians preferred a non-cash instrument, mainly cards. And together with France, this was actually the highest score of all countries involved. Higher than in countries such as the Netherlands, Estonia, Finland, countries where the number of card payments per person was substantially higher and still is substantially higher. So there appeared to be a disjoint, so to speak, between Belgians' payment preferences and their actual payment behavior. And part of the explanation appeared to be simply lower card acceptance by merchants. In the ECB study, consumers were asked whether it would have been possible to pay by card in shops where they had paid cash. And in the Netherlands, Estonia, Finland, this was effectively the case in nearly 90% of the cases. And in Belgium, the number was only, quote-unquote, 80%, implying that in 20% of the cases, the merchant did not accept cards. So in Belgium, the bottleneck for increased card usage at the time was apparently on the merchant side. And that's in line with anecdotal evidence at the time. I'm thinking of markets, for example, hairdressers, some of the smaller shops, where it was effectively not always possible to pay by card. Now, in the meantime, obviously, card acceptance increased somewhat on account of the pandemic. But now, with the new requirement, acceptance should be near perfect, meaning if the ECB numbers were a correct representation of reality, this pent-up demand, so to speak, should lead to a substantial increase in card payments or other electronic payments, because merchants have a choice in which payment instruments they accept. So I'm really, really curious to see the first numbers for July. I haven't seen any yet, but I expect to see a spike in the number of card payments.
It's a good point that you make, that the requirement is to accept electronic payments of some kind. By default, I think many people associate that with a debit or a credit card payment. Do you think that's the route that merchants will go, or do you think, again, it might just be anecdotal from what you're seeing?
It's just anecdotal. They either now accept cards in the, say, traditional way with a card terminal, or they accept Payconic, which is less costly for merchants, also in terms of infrastructure. And I've also seen cases where merchants have this piece of paper on their cash register with their bank account number, where you can simply make a credit transfer on the spot using your mobile phone and then the mobile app of your bank, which is obviously less convenient for consumers, but at least they offer some sort of electronic payment option.
I wonder whether that's also allowed legislation like this to come in, is the fact that actually you no longer need a big investment on the merchant side. If you want, it can be as simple as a QR code in the shop and someone scans it on their mobile phone. So it's not suddenly forcing all merchants to spend thousands on terminals or infrastructure, or so perhaps that makes it possible where previously it would have been politically unacceptable to force that. When we were writing our Payments Digital Divide paper, we talked in that a lot about the convenience factor. And you mentioned that people during the pandemic perhaps tried contactless for the first time, but perhaps continued using it because they found it convenient once they'd got used to it. But one of our findings was also that we didn't believe convenience alone was enough to attract people to using a new payments means. So in other words, all digital payments, for people to use them, they have to be convenient. I mean, if it's not convenient, people won't use it. But being marginally more convenient than how you pay currently is not going to persuade someone to switch, which I think is consistent with what you were saying earlier. But what do you think can or does encourage people to adopt new ways to pay? And I guess you've mentioned already COVID, where it became a health hygiene factor, and you've mentioned posters in the canteen. So I guess those are two examples already. But are there other things that you think can encourage people to adopt new payment methods?
Well, number one is acceptance, as just explained. Payment instruments are a prime example of so-called network goods, where utility increases with the size of the network. So the more merchants accept a certain payment instrument, the more consumers will or should be interested in using this payment instrument. Conversely, on the other side, and we've already briefly touched upon that, one should not underestimate the force of habits. Some years ago, researchers of the Dutch Central Bank published a paper with a really nice and appropriate title. The title was "In Love with the Debit Card, but Still Married to Cash." And in this paper, they demonstrated that there is substantial inertia in people's payment behavior, because many Dutch consumers stated that their preferred payment instrument was the debit card, but when looking at their actual payment behavior, measured by means of payment diaries, so hard data, they still used cash surprisingly often. So this goes to show that when people have been paying in a certain way, in a specific spot, for years on end, their morning coffee, say, they are slow to switch to different means of payment. And apparently, sometimes a trigger is needed, as we've seen with COVID-19. That has clearly been an important trigger for Belgians to start using contactless and for some to start using mobile.
So in a moment, I'd really like to find out from you, Leo, your view on whether you think countries will ever go fully cashless, and how soon you think that could happen, if it will happen. But first, I just want to mention that people, if they want to read the Payments Digital Divide paper, then you can download it by visiting worldline.com and clicking on Knowledge Hub and then Scientific Reports. In the next episode, we're going to be discussing with Denis Fevre, who is the head of innovation at Worldline, this question of what if you never have to pay for anything, which I should probably explain is about autonomous payments and bots and AI paying on people's behalf, rather than the idea of no money ever leaving your account. And of course, also just to say, if you want to get in contact with us, propose future topics, give us any feedback, then you can reach us on ndp-podcast@worldline.com. And of course, please, if you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and a review. So, Leo, back to this question of whether countries will go fully cashless. There's some speculation that I was seeing about which country might be the first to go fully cashless. And I even saw one report that it could be Finland by March 2023, which seems really soon to me. So do you think countries might go fully cashless? And if so, what do you think are their reasons for wanting to do that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball. Yeah. But Scandinavian countries are prime candidates. That's for sure. Not only Finland, but also Sweden, Iceland comes to mind. But it also depends on one's definition of a cashless society. If it means that someone who prefers not to use cash doesn't need to, then I guess some of these countries are already there or almost there. If, however, it means a society where coins and banknotes literally are no longer used by anyone, that's a different story. Because for this to happen, I guess in most countries, and definitely in Belgium, the central bank would need to decide to abolish banknotes. Because as long as banknotes exist, there will be a demand for reasons both legitimate and less legitimate. Unless that is, and that appears to be the case in some of these Scandinavian countries, cash at a certain point in time becomes so marginalized that many merchants, and even most merchants, no longer accept it. And then we're back to acceptance, as already discussed. And this also brings me to the second part of your question about benefits and drawbacks. Several central banks have actually recently become concerned that the evolution towards a cashless or a less cash society is going too fast. Because there are still people who really rely on cash. In the words of the Riksbank, the Central Bank of Sweden, cash-free does not equate with problem-free. And the Central Bank of the Netherlands is also a good example. They recently published a document entitled Vision on Payments 2022-2025, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the key goals of this vision is, and I quote, I've written it down, ensuring that cash continues to function as a means of payment. So you have central banks who have really become aware that social exclusion is a potential danger of a cashless society. And then, loss of privacy is also seen as a problem by some. Then there is the issue of resilience of our payments infrastructure, an issue that is also on the radar of the Dutch Central Bank, because today cash is still available as a fallback option. If something goes wrong with card networks, with the internet, with electricity these days, and one never knows. But what if cash no longer exists? What if cash has become completely marginalized? How will we cope then? So that is clearly also a challenge. On the other side, on the plus side, the benefits, the main one is increased efficiency. Because not many people realize this, but cash is actually a costly payment instrument for society. It is a physical payment instrument, will always remain a physical payment instrument. And the implication is that, there's a lot of labor involved. Cash needs to be counted, recounted, transported in a secure way, moreover, needs to be sorted, inspected for quality, and so on. So this entire cash circulation process comes with a high social cost, which we pay, all of us, either directly or indirectly. And a crucial element of the problem is also that a large part of this cash infrastructure represents a fixed cost. You need a minimum infrastructure to make these cash payments or to make them available. So this means that as the number of cash payments goes down, which is what is happening these days, the average cost of a cash payment will only increase. So that will increasingly become an issue, a problem. So it's clear that electronic payments are more cost efficient. And then there's also tax evasion, as already mentioned, robberies of banks and shops, which can also be considered to be indirect social costs related to the existence of cash. If there's no cash anymore, or hardly, then all of these mishaps will not disappear, because thieves and tax evaders will always find new ways, but the traditional way of bank robberies and so on will then go away.
Two things came to my mind there, Leo. So one is that I think in the UK something like 160,000 people don't have a bank account, and I think it's a fair assumption that those people are probably more reliant on cash than you or I. And indeed, I was even looking at the UK government website, and they still, in say the payment of benefits, for example, make allowances for collecting it in cash from a post office, or they provide options. And whilst 160,000 is not a large percentage of the UK population, clearly it's unacceptable to cut that group off, and so until they have meaningful access to digital payments, you can't, I think, remove cash. And I think we talked a bit about it as well when we were discussing the digital divide paper, that of course one of the challenges is that the digital divide becomes bigger the more marginal the use of cash becomes. So as you say, if suddenly only 1 in 20 shops accepted cash, which in theory could happen in the UK, I imagine they might legislate to prevent that if it became a reality, but actually in theory that could happen, then that small percentage of the population that's relying on cash becomes worse off and more marginalised than they are today. But the other thing I think is interesting is on resilience, because I think on the one hand, the physical payment instruments using cash, but I was thinking even things like goods like gold, things that are physical, are resilient because they don't rely on any technology, they don't need electricity, so that's all good. In very practical terms, though, I think in our house we probably have less than £50 in cash in total, and after that I'd have to go to an ATM. So actually, if
the ATMs don't work, indeed,
cash would keep us going for a few days, but it's not much more resilient for our. Now I guess there are probably some people that have thousands of pounds under their mattress and they could go for longer, but again, and without electronic payments I couldn't receive my salary, so actually, cash would probably get us by for a few hours or a few days, but I think we're already at the stage where there would be a significant negative impact on society if suddenly digital payments disappeared for any period of time. So it's an interesting one. So coming right back round, Leo, to that main question we had at the start of, it's the question you thought could be a title of your paper. Who could be afraid of a cashless society? Who are the people that would be most worried about us potentially switching cash off if that was to happen?
Well, this in fact brings us back to the issue of social exclusion that we have already touched upon. As I mentioned in the foreword to your Payments Digital Divide report, we also observe such a divide in our Digital Payment Barometer data, where the overall picture is one where the payment behavior of the majority of Belgian consumers evolves in the way one would expect. And they rely less and less on cash, and where card payments are concerned, they move from contact-based to contactless. And the younger age groups gradually also move to mobile. That's the picture for the majority of Belgian consumers. But at the same time, there is a subgroup of consumers who continue to prefer cash over electronic payments, and who are not ready to embrace a cashless society, either because they can't or because they don't want to. In our survey, we asked respondents about their favorite payment instrument in a retail setting. And in 2020, so before COVID, 16% said cash, 16%. During the pandemic, for obvious reasons, this number dropped to 13%. But this year, so post-COVID, more or less, it went up again to 16%, exactly the pre-COVID level. We also have a question where we ask respondents whether a cashless society would be a problem for them, and here 17% indicated that they would not cope. So there is a group of what you could call die-hard cash users. It's a relatively small group, but as you pointed out, it should not be neglected nor left behind. And in my view, this really is an important policy challenge for politicians and banks alike, especially where education is concerned. Because clearly, in this resistance against cashless society and the unwillingness to use electronic payments, age is a factor. But it's clearly not the only one. Because interestingly, in our barometer, during the pandemic, the biggest jumps in the uptake of contactless was amongst the older age groups. Right? So it's not as if all old people are unable or unwilling to use contactless. That's not the case. That was really interesting to see. So it's not only age, it's also education, and more specifically, I guess, digital literacy. And interestingly, that is a factor that is actionable. Age isn't, obviously, but literacy is actionable. Yeah. So, in my view, banks and payment providers should teach people how to use their products. And KBC has an interesting new initiative in this respect. It's called KBC Belmobiel, which is difficult to translate in English. It has nothing to do with a mobile app, but it's a service for people who have either mobility problems or people who do not know how to use the internet and all these apps. And the service consists in a KBC employee actually going to people's home to help them on the spot with all these problems. And this is the sort of initiative that we should see more of, in my view. Help people make this migration to a cashless society that will happen.
Leo, in your results then, did I understand correctly that the biggest jump in take-up of contactless you saw in the older generations Indeed. During COVID? Okay. And I wonder whether that, again, coming back to the habits point, is that perhaps for the older generations, paying by cash was more a habit, and faced with an absolute need to switch, it wasn't that they couldn't, they could. But maybe in the younger generations, people who are paying with cash are doing so more out of necessity.
That's a possible explanation. And I also guess that the older age groups, because we're talking 65, 74 and also 75 plus, were more concerned about hygiene and the risk of getting infected. We did not ask people why. We just measure with our barometer. We don't ask people why they do something or don't do something.
Coming back then also to that education point and financial literacy, it's your belief, is it, that if people can understand how to use these products, these services, have some help to do that? And I think it's worth, certainly in my view, it's not always just about the technical ability, but it's knowing that you know, when will you get charged interest? How can you avoid extra charges on your account for it? These are the, how can you avoid going overdrawn? But it's your view, is it, that if people can understand these digital payments better and how to have a bank account, then they are more likely to adopt and be more comfortable using them?
I think in many cases it's all about making this first step. Because I remember my father being, how shall I put it, a bit distressed because the gas station where he used to take gas no longer accepted banknotes. And he had these machines that accepted banknotes, and then you could... so the first couple of times I had to accompany him to show how to make a card payment. And after a while he got a hang of it, and then he continued using it. So even though he was, I guess, close to 80 at the time.
But as you say, it's a good point. Taking the first step is then what enables you to do it. We had a guest on a previous episode, Rob Price, talking about his parents-in-law doing online shopping for the first time during the pandemic, but then finding actually they prefer that. Someone brings it all to their door. But of course you need somehow the incentive or the understanding to take the first step and to experience the benefits. So, Leo, it's been a wide-ranging discussion. I feel like we've packed a lot into a short time. It was really interesting to hear your sort of first tentative conclusions from the report you're writing that's based on the Payments Barometer data. And And also really interesting, I think, generally to hear your views on, can society shift to being cashless? What are the potential benefits? What are the drawbacks? Who could be left behind? And then those final thoughts actually on what can we do to help the people that would be left behind be more included in digital payments. So yeah, really want to thank you, Leo, for joining us. That's been absolutely fascinating.
My pleasure.
And of course, just last of all, thank you, our listeners, for joining us in this episode of Navigating Digital Payments.
Thank you for listening to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline. Join us next time to learn more about the latest innovations, trends, and predictions for the future of payments.